My name is Eleanor Whitford, and on my 62nd birthday, my sister announced she was pregnant with my husband's child. She stood at the end of the long table inside Harrington's Steakhouse, as if she were delivering a toast of her own. Her voice, bright and sharp enough to slice through every conversation. "We're a family now," she sneered, resting a hand on her stomach, like a woman in a dramatic scene on daytime television. Forks froze in midair. A busboy dropped a stack of bread plates. Even the soft jazz floating from the ceiling speakers seemed to dim. And all eyes, every last one, turned to me. What no one knew, not my husband Daniel, not my sister Marlene, not the dozen friends and relatives gathered under the golden lights, was that I had been waiting for this exact moment. I had spent months preparing for it. I didn't break. I didn't scream. I didn't even blink. I simply lifted my glass, the champagne, catching the glow of the chandelier, and smiled. I had a truth of my own, one they weren't ready for. But to explain how I got there to that moment, when I raised a toast instead of collapsing, I have to take you back a few months. Because birthdays don't arrive out of thin air, and betrayals rarely show up unannounced. They grow quietly, like mold, behind a cabinet, until one day something shifts just enough that you finally smell it. 3 months before the dinner, Daniel had become a ghost in our own home. He'd been a quiet man before steady, dependable, the sort of husband who'd rather fix the kitchen sink himself than hire help. But suddenly, he was quieter, distracted. His eyes wouldn't meet mine when I spoke to him. He started taking late meetings twice a week. He shaved more often. Bought a new cologne he claimed was on sale at the drugstore. But the first real warning sign came from Mrs. Adler next door. She's nearly 80 sharp as a tack, and nothing escapes her window. One morning, she waved me over while she watered her zinnias. "Saw Marlene in town yesterday," she said casually, like she was commenting on the weather. "Funny thing she was, with your Daniel." They looked like they were in quite a hurry. I felt something in my stomach twist, but I brushed it off. My sister had always leaned on Daniel for advice. He worked in insurance, and she was always asking him about policies, car rates, renters coverage, you name it. But there was a tone in Mrs. Adler's voice, a softness, a sympathy, the kind people use when they already know something you don't. After that, I began to notice everything. How Marlene stopped coming to my house, how she texted Daniel late at night with messages that he shoved deep into his pocket before I could catch the glow of his screen, how she suddenly had money, new purses, a fancy haircut, a manicure that definitely wasn't done at the cheap strip mall salon she normally used. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, Marlene had been fragile her whole life. A string of breakups, impulsive decisions, debts she expected family to help her with. She'd always needed rescuing, and I'd always been the one to rescue her. But something shifted on a cold Tuesday afternoon in the pharmacy aisle. Daniel and I were picking up his blood pressure medication when we ran into Marlene. She was dressed up, too dressed up. Full makeup, a silky blouse, heels, slick enough to reflect the fluorescent lights. And Daniel stepped back like a teenager caught doing something wrong. Marlene's smile didn't help. It was too wide, too confident, too familiar. From that moment forward, everything inside me went still. Not numb, still. Like the way lake water freezes on the surface while currents churn underneath. I didn't confront them. Instead, I did something I never believed myself capable of. I watched. I listened. I learned. And the more I looked, the more cracks I found. Daniel's paychecks weren't lining up with our deposits. A withdrawal here, a transfer there, small at first, then larger. Money was disappearing. I called my oldest friend Linda, who had spent 30 years working in a law office before retiring. She told me to gather every bank statement I could get my hands on, record dates, save messages, build a timeline. Eleanor, she said, her voice low, people who cheat don't always stop at cheating. That sentence rattled me more than the affair itself. She was right. Within weeks, I discovered Daniel had opened a separate savings account, one with Marlene listed as the beneficiary. He'd been moving money into it for months. When I confronted him lightly, more curiosity than accusation, he brushed it off as financial planning. But I had proof now, and something inside me hardened. When the invitation for my birthday dinner went out, a small gathering Daniel insisted on hosting, I knew what was coming. I could see the storm forming behind their eyes. Marlene became bolder. Daniel became jumpier. Something big was brewing. Something they were preparing to reveal. So I prepared too. Linda helped me organize every piece of evidence into a single manila envelope. On the front, in my neat handwriting, I wrote, "To be opened at dinner." And when the evening finally arrived, when Marlene stood there smirking, one hand on her stomach, my husband staring at me like a man waiting for a bomb to explode, I kept my silence. I let her finish her little performance. Then slowly, I lifted my champagne glass and smiled, because the truth I carried was heavier than theirs, and far more devastating. If anyone at that dinner thought Marlene's announcement was the first crack in my marriage, they were wrong. By the time she stood there with her smug little beam, pretending to cradle a child who likely didn't exist, the cracks had already become canyons. I had simply learned to walk around them without falling in. The truth is, betrayal rarely arrives like a lightning strike. It creeps, it leaves crumbs, and it always starts long before the moment you finally acknowledge it. After that day in the pharmacy, after seeing Marlene dressed like she had somewhere important to be, and Daniel looking like he'd swallowed a stone, I began paying attention with a new kind of clarity. Not suspicion, not paranoia, something quieter, something colder, something almost clinical. Take Daniel's work trips, for example. He'd always had occasional overnight meetings, but they suddenly multiplied. Twice a month became twice a week. His excuses were vague, the kind of explanations he might have gotten away with 20 years ago. But not with the man. He'd become a creature of routine, the sort who prepared his clothes the night before and set out his coffee mug with military precision. But now he returned home, with shirt's wrinkled hair, tousled, smelling like a hotel lobby instead of the office. He stopped wearing his wedding ring, claimed it made his finger itch. He kept his phone face down, always locked, always guarded. And whenever I mentioned my sister, even casually, his jaw tightened ever so slightly, just enough to notice, just enough to confirm what I already feared. Marlene, meanwhile, became harder to read. She stopped calling me entirely. She used to phone several times a week, complaining about money, asking advice, borrowing recipes, filling the silence of her own life with my listening ear. But now she answered with clipped, one-word responses, or not at all. And when she did show up, she looked different. New clothes, new nails, new confidence. She even started posting pictures of expensive wine bottles and dinner plates on social media pictures, taken in restaurants far above her bank account's tolerance. At first, people assumed I had gifted her the money. I'd always been the provider in our family, the caretaker, the older sister, who stepped in whenever Marlene fell apart. But this time, I hadn't given her a single dollar. That's when I started reviewing our financial accounts. Not dramatically, just logging into online banking the way I always had. But this time, I looked deeper. I checked transfers, side accounts, credit lines. And that's where I found it small. Withdrawals. At first, then larger ones. Money from our joint savings, drifting away like smoke. Some transactions were labeled with Daniel's initials, others with hers. At the bottom of one statement, I saw it. Transfer to M. Whitford beneficiary update pending. My blood ran cold. I printed every page and slipped them into a folder. Linda, my friend of 40 years, looked at the papers in silence when I showed them to her. She had worked in a law office long enough to recognize patterns, ugly, painful patterns involving spouses who betrayed not just hearts, but bank accounts. "This isn't just an affair, Eleanor," she said finally. "This is preparation. Preparation for what I asked, though in my chest, I already knew. To leave you," she replied, "and to take more than his share when he does." Her words struck me like wind, knocking the breath out of my lungs. Over the next few weeks, Linda taught me what to look for. She showed me how to print digital correspondence, how to check county property filings, how to read the metadata hidden in emails. We weren't investigators, but we were older women who had lived through enough storms to know how to board up windows before the rain came. And as we dug, more filth rose to the surface. Receipts from hotels, an hour outside town, payments to a private mailbox service, a new life insurance policy. Daniel had taken out one that required my signature, but didn't have it, at least not my real one. Marlene's name appeared in places it never should have listed as an emergency contact, a secondary beneficiary, and worst of all, the co-owner of an account Daniel had opened without telling me. I felt sick, then angry, then strangely calm. That calmness was dangerous, Linda warned, because it meant I was finally seeing things clearly. One afternoon, I drove to my parents' old home, now empty and quiet, to retrieve boxes of documents I hadn't touched in years. That's where I found something that nearly broke me. A binder Marlene had kept during my mother's final months. A binder filled with receipts, estate notes, and small withdrawals Marlene had made on our mother's behalf. Withdrawals my mother could not have authorized. My hands trembled as I held the binder. The betrayal was no longer new. It had roots, it had history, and I had been too exhausted caring for everyone else to notice. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of lukewarm tea, staring at the envelope I had begun building my growing archive of truth. It was thick, now full of pages no one expected me to understand, let alone collect. But I understood more than they thought. Betrayal sharpens the mind. Pain organizes priorities. And silence, true silence, has a way of becoming power. By the time Daniel suggested hosting a birthday dinner for me at Harrington's, his voice all honey and obligation, I already knew what the evening would become. A stage, a reveal, a reckoning. Marlene arrived that night, glowing like she'd won a prize. Daniel hovered beside her, nervous but determined. And I watched them both with the quiet certainty of someone holding a secret far heavier than theirs. The morning after I slipped that envelope into my purse, everything in my world felt unnervingly quiet. Not peaceful quiet, the kind of quiet people feel before a tornado touches down. Still air, heavy sky, something shifting even indoors. I moved through the house that day, aware that my life had already begun splitting into two halves before the truth and after I decided to document it. But collecting proof of betrayal is nothing like catching someone in a lie on television. It's not glamorous, not fast, and not dramatic. It's slow, tedious, humbling, and it requires a level of patience I didn't know I still had in my 60s. I began with bank statements, old ones, new ones, ones I hadn't looked at in years. Daniel always handled the numbers. He claimed it reduced my stress. I see now that it reduced my visibility. There were gaps I couldn't explain. Transfers I didn't remember agreeing to, withdrawals, labeled with initials I didn't recognize. Some were to local places, some weren't. One withdrawal in particular caught my eye: $4,800 Eagle Ridge Suites, Fort Meadow. Fort Meadow was where Marlene used to take her secret getaways when she needed a break from life. Funny how she always claimed she was broke during those breaks. Funny how Daniel had stopped letting me see his receipts from work trips around that same time. The more I scanned through those papers, the worse the dread became. My hands shook, but I kept digging. I told myself I deserved to know the truth, even the pieces that sliced my heart open a little. By the end of the afternoon, 3 manila folders lay open on the kitchen table, each one filled with evidence, hotel bills, transfers, inconsistencies. I color-coded them like Linda had taught me: yellow for financial, blue for digital, red for anything involving property beneficiaries or legal ties. Linda came over the next morning with her reading glasses and her sharp legal mind. She moved slowly these days, arthritis tightening her joints, but her brain, thank God, was still faster than most lawyers I'd ever met. "Well," she said, flipping through the yellow folder. They weren't subtle. I wanted to protest, to defend Daniel, to suggest that maybe some of these entries had innocent explanations. The part of me that had spent decades smoothing over problems almost opened my mouth, but something stopped me. That quiet, still air again. The sense that if I softened now, even for a second, I would lose everything. "Keep going," I told her. The next piece of evidence was bigger: a savings account Daniel had opened 2 years earlier. I didn't remember signing anything. I didn't even remember the day he said it was created. Linda tapped the page gently. "That," she said, "is not your signature." I stared at the looped, delicate handwriting, pretending to be mine. It looked like someone had copied my signature from a birthday card or an old check, and not well. That she added is forgery. My head swam. A marriage of 40 years, and here I was, discovering crimes tucked behind the laundry baskets and grocery lists. We moved to the blue folder emails. I had found them buried in Daniel's old laptop, the one he stopped using after we upgraded our home office. He must have forgotten what was stored on it. Or maybe he didn't think I'd ever open it. Emails between Daniel and Marlene weren't romantic. They were worse. They were transactional. Discussions about timing, talk of preparing the transition, conversations about assets, about me getting tired, about whether this was the right moment to make their move. It was betrayal, yes, but it was also strategy. They had been planning a future without me in it, and with my money helping build it. "Do you want to take a break?" Linda asked softly. "No," I said. "I want to finish." The red folder was last. Property records, insurance policies, estate designations, all the things Daniel had always handled, claiming he wanted to take the burden off my shoulders. I was not relieved. I was not grateful. I was furious. There it was, again, Marlene's name, named as secondary beneficiary, listed as contact for one of our rental properties, marked on a revised beneficiary form for Daniel's life insurance policy, again with a signature that wasn't mine. My heart felt heavy, but strangely steady. Betrayal doesn't always bring panic. Sometimes it brings clarity. "This is enough to protect you," Linda said, at last, tapping the stack of proof. and more than enough to bury him if he tries to take anything from you." "Will it hold up?" I asked. She nodded. "Absolutely. You have a timeline documentation motive pattern of behavior, financial evidence, and forgery. Courts take forgery very seriously, especially when the victim is a long-term spouse." Her words didn't comfort me. Not fully, because legal victories don't heal emotional wounds. But they do give you leverage. And leverage was exactly what I needed. That night, I sat alone in the living room. The sun had gone down hours earlier, leaving only the soft lamp beside my recliner glowing. The house felt unfamiliar, as if the truth had rearranged the furniture inside it. Daniel came home, late smelling of hotel soap and cheap cologne. He kissed the top of my head like he used to when we were younger. Something inside me recoiled. Not visibly, but in a way I couldn't ignore. He asked about my day. I told him it was quiet. That wasn't a lie. It was the most dangerous kind of quiet. Before I went to bed, I took the now thick envelope from the folders, condensed, organized, indisputable, and slid it into my purse. The same purse I brought to every family event. The same purse no one thought twice about. I ran my fingers over the flap and whispered to the stillness in the room soon. Because I knew Marlene, and I knew Daniel, and I knew they wouldn't be able to resist staging something at my birthday dinner. Something dramatic, something humiliating, something they believed would break me. But I had my own reveal waiting, and mine was backed with evidence that no crocodile tears or fake pregnancy announcement could overshadow. By the time my birthday arrived, the envelope in my purse weighed almost nothing, but the truth inside it carried the weight of every lie they ever told. Walking into Harrington Steakhouse that evening felt like stepping into a stage, set one I hadn't designed, but one I fully intended to control. The chandeliers glowed with their usual amber warmth. The tables were set with white linens and flickering candles, and the low murmur of conversations filled the room like gentle static. It was familiar, elegant, predictable. And yet, beneath all of that, there was a tension so thick I could practically taste it. Daniel had insisted on hosting the dinner. He said it was time we celebrated life more words that sounded sweet enough if I didn't already have proof of what he was planning behind the scenes. Marlene arrived early, glowing in a way that might have fooled anyone who didn't know her. She wore a soft pink dress, too youthful for a woman her age, and her makeup was heavier than usual, as if she wanted every expression to be noticed, every flutter of her eyelashes recorded. She greeted me with exaggerated warmth. "Happy birthday, Ellie," she said, using the nickname only she still insisted on. She leaned in to hug me, but her eyes flicked downward toward my purse. A quick glance, sharp, calculated, and then she stepped back, her smile brittle around the edges. "You look calm tonight," she remarked. I smiled. It's a good evening for calm. She didn't know what to do with that answer. She blinked 3 times, forced a laugh, and drifted back to Daniel, who stood stiffly near the bar, tugging at his shirt collar, like a man already feeling the noose. Guests began to arrive, old friends, a few cousins, neighbors who'd known us for decades. Everyone hugged me warmly. Everyone congratulated Daniel on putting together such a lovely evening. And everyone noticed in some small way that Marlene hovered closer to my husband than any sister-in-law should. Dinner started normally enough. Salads were served. Bread baskets passed around. People shared stories about my childhood, my garden, my quilting group. I nodded politely, chewed, carefully raised my glass when appropriate. But underneath it all, I waited, And I knew Marlene and Daniel waited too. The moment arrived when the waiter placed the birthday cake in front of me. Thick frosting, delicate piping, 62 candles, each one flickering, as if the room itself were holding its breath. The group sang. I smiled. And then, as the last note hung in the air, Marlene rose from her chair as if she'd been lifted by strings. She tapped her fork against her wine glass, an actor calling for silence. I have an announcement. She began, placing a dramatic hand across her flat stomach. The exaggeration was so theatrical, it almost insulted my intelligence. I know this might not be the best time, but life doesn't always wait for a perfect moment. Gasps rose from around the table. Daniel looked down, pretending to be ashamed. A performance, every bit of it. She took a shaky breath that was undeniably rehearsed. I'm pregnant, she said, her voice trembling on the edges. And Daniel, he's the father. A collective inhale sucked the air out of the room. Someone whispered, "Good Lord." Another muttered, "No," under their breath. Daniel stood slowly, placing his hands on the table, as if bracing himself. His voice cracked. "Ellie, I didn't know how to tell you." I held up a single hand. "Sit," I said. He sat, immediately. Marlene blinked hard, thrown off by my lack of reaction. "Ellie, I know this is a shock. This is a dinner," I corrected calmly, "so let's treat it like one." I reached for my purse. My movements were slow, deliberate. The room leaned forward, as if it were one single body. "This," I said, placing the envelope on the table in front of me, "is my announcement." Marlene's face blanched. Daniel swallowed so loudly the table heard it. I slid the envelope toward the center of the table. Inside, you'll find bank transfers totaling over $35,000, every penny stolen from our joint account. You'll find beneficiary changes on 2 insurance policies, one of which bears a signature that is not mine. Eyes widened. Chairs creaked. Someone whispered, "Oh, dear God." And I continued. You'll find a fully documented timeline of your hotel stays, your financial correspondence, and the emails in which you, I pointed gently toward Daniel, outline your plan to transition into a new life. Once you thought I was too tired to fight. Daniel's face drained of color. "Ellie. And you," I added, turning to Marlene, "might want to explain the text messages you sent, bragging about your retirement plan being funded by my husband." Marlene's lip trembled. The smirk she'd shown earlier was gone, wiped clean, replaced by pure panic. Someone farther down the table covered their mouth. Another guest pushed their chair back, as if physically repelled by the ugliness revealed. I wasn't finished. "As for your pregnancy," I said softly, "you might want to buy a new prop." The test you used still had the drugstore sticker on the back, and the timestamp in the metadata of the photo you sent Daniel. It was taken last year. A whisper rippled across the table. Marlene shook her head violently. "That's not. You're lying. This isn't." I raised my champagne glass, the very same gesture I'd practiced in my mind for months. "To truth," I said simply, and the table remained silent. No one drank with me, not even Daniel. Marlene's chair scraped loudly as she pushed it back. She stood, shaking her breath, coming in sharp, furious bursts. "You ruined everything," she shouted. "No," I said, setting my glass down gently. "You ruined everything long before tonight. I'm simply shining a light so you can see the wreckage." Daniel buried his face in his hands. The birthday candles flickered. No one moved. And for the first time in years, I felt tall, solid, unshakable. I had walked into their performance, but I had delivered the final act. The drive home after that dinner felt strangely peaceful quiet, in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Not the heavy silence that comes from suspicion or dread, but a clean quiet. A quiet that follows a storm after it's finally broken open and released everything it had been holding back. The night air outside my window was cool, the streetlights soft, the small Midwestern town moving on with its life, while mine shifted permanently. Daniel didn't come home that night. I wasn't surprised. He didn't call either. I wasn't surprised by that either. People who are forced to face their own choices rarely know what to say in the aftermath. Sometimes they run toward excuses. Sometimes they simply run. I brewed myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen table looking at the same envelope that had once felt heavy in my purse. Now it sat like a completed assignment, a transition point, the end of pretending. The next morning, the phone started ringing. First it was Linda, then my cousin Ruth, then my neighbor Mrs. Adler, who had already heard about the scene from someone who overheard from someone else. In small towns, news travels with the eagerness of a gossiping church choir. Every caller had the same tone, a mixture of shock sympathy and something else respect. The kind that older women reserve for moments when someone finally stands up in a way they secretly wish they had. By noon, the news reached Daniel's workplace. He was a respected claims adjuster, known for his honesty and fairness qualities that now seemed almost comedic, given the documentation I had shared. His boss called me privately. "Eleanor, we're conducting an internal review. We didn't know about the financial irregularities. I'm so sorry." "I didn't either," I replied. "Not until recently." He sighed heavily. "If there's anything you need, please let us know." That line told me more than anything. Daniel's professional life was crumbling right alongside his personal one. That afternoon, Daniel finally texted, "We need to talk." I didn't respond. I didn't owe him a conversation until I was ready. Later that evening, someone banged on my door, loud, repeated, not angry, frantic. I opened it, expecting Daniel. Instead, Marlene stood there, mascara streaked down her cheeks. Her pink dress wrinkled her hair, frizzy, from tears, or humidity, or both. "You destroyed my life," she shouted, before I could say a word. "You humiliated me in front of everyone. You made me look crazy." I kept my voice calm. "You did that yourself." "You always think you're better than me," she snapped. "You always think you're smarter." "I never thought I was smarter," I corrected. "I just paid attention." For a moment, she looked like a child, again, the same child who cried when she didn't get her way, who ran to me instead of owning her mistakes. But she wasn't a child now. She was a grown woman who had knowingly woven herself into a betrayal. Marlene's bravado collapsed. She fell against the porch railing and sobbed loudly. "He promised me a future. He said he'd leave you. He said we'd be happy. And now? And now you face the consequences," I said gently. "Just like he does." She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. "You're going to press charges." "I already submitted the paperwork," I replied. "Forgery, financial misconduct, fraud." Her eyes widened with real fear. "Ellie, please, I'm your sister. And I loved you," I said, my voice cracking for the first time in days. "But loving you doesn't mean you get to steal from me. It doesn't mean you get to manipulate my life. It doesn't mean you get to break me and walk away whole." She stared at me, realizing something monumental. I wasn't going to save her this time. The roles we had always played, her taking me giving, were gone. She left my porch without another word. The next few days were a blur of fallout. Daniel moved into a co-worker's spare bedroom. People from church asked carefully worded questions that I answered with equally careful phrases. I wasn't interested in spreading ugliness, but I wasn't going to protect their reputations either. Daniel showed up at the house twice, knocking softly, as if afraid the wood itself might reject him. The first time, I didn't answer. The second time, I stepped outside. He looked smaller, somehow, shoulders slumped, hair uncombed, eyes red. "Ellie," he said, voice trembling. "I never meant for it to go this far." "Yet here we are," I replied. He swallowed. "I was confused. I made mistakes. I let Marlene control." I held up a hand. "Do not blame her for your choices. You knew better. You just didn't do better." He looked down ashamed. "I'm sorry." For the first time, I almost believed him. But apologies don't erase evidence. They don't reverse betrayals. They don't rebuild trust. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now," I said, "we separate our lives. Legally, financially, emotionally." He nodded slowly, as if coming to terms with a reality he thought he'd escape. Within a week, I filed for divorce. The attorney Linda recommended was steady, empathetic, and firm. "You have everything you need," he told me, after reviewing my evidence. "This will be clean. He won't get the chance to take another cent." Meanwhile, Marlene's world unraveled faster than Daniel's. She lost her job. Her friends distanced themselves. The police requested interviews regarding the forged signature on the insurance policy. Small towns don't easily forget public humiliation, especially when it's self-inflicted. But none of this brought me joy, not satisfaction, not revenge in the childish sense. What I felt was something quieter, relief, closure, a release of years I hadn't realized were weighed down by their manipulation. And through that quiet, I began to think about what life might look like on the other side of all this. Not revenge, rebuilding. The first morning I woke up alone after filing for divorce felt strangely unfamiliar. Not lonely, just different. I opened the curtains, let the sunlight fill the bedroom Daniel and I had shared for decades, and realized it was the first time in years that the room felt like mine. Not a shared space, not a battleground of resentment and unspoken fears, just mine. I made coffee the way I liked it, strong, with a touch of cinnamon. Daniel never liked cinnamon. Funny how that small detail suddenly felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. The house was quiet, but not in that suffocating way it used to be when I sensed lies hanging in the air. This was a warm quiet, a peaceful quiet, a quiet that whispered possibility. I spent those first few days doing something simple but necessary cleaning. Not the usual weekly tidying, but a full clearing out of the emotional debris that had gathered in corners of my life. Daniel's cologne bottles went into a box. His clothes, the ones he hadn't taken, were folded and set aside. Old papers were shredded. And in that process, I discovered something remarkable. When you remove the things that hurt you, even a room begins to breathe differently. But healing wasn't just about reorganizing drawers or drinking coffee the way I preferred. I needed connection too, so I let people back into my life slowly, carefully, authentically. Linda visited almost every day. She'd bring muffins, sit at my kitchen table, and chat about gentle things, her garden, her grandkids' church events. She never pushed me to talk, but she always left space if I chose to. That is the kind of friendship age gifts you patience without pressure. My neighbor, Mrs. Adler, brought over a casserole and said in her blunt way, "It's about time you stopped carrying everyone else's weight." Coming from her, that was practically poetry. Even people I hadn't heard from in years sent cards or stopped by. Older women, especially, understood the betrayal in a way younger ones might not. Many had lived through their own disappointments, their own fractures in trust. Their empathy came wrapped in wisdom, not pity. Still, there were quiet moments, late evenings and early mornings, when I felt the echo of loss. Not for Daniel, but for the life I had imagined my marriage would be. Loss of trust, loss of certainty, loss of the version of myself who believed some things were unbreakable. But loss, I learned, is a teacher, and it doesn't whisper. It speaks plainly. One afternoon, I attended a support group at the community center. Linda suggested it, not because she thought I was fragile, but because she knew healing is often shared. The group was made up mostly of older adults, widows, divorcees, people caring for aging spouses, people who had lost family or discovered hidden betrayals like mine. When it was my turn to speak, I expected my voice to shake. It didn't. "I'm not angry anymore," I said. "I'm tired, but not defeated. Just tired of holding things that weren't mine to carry." A woman across the circle nodded slowly. Another squeezed my hand afterward and whispered, "You're stronger than you think." Maybe I was, or maybe I was finally giving myself permission to be. Around that time, Daniel began sending letters. Long, handwritten pages filled with apologies, explanations, and memories he hoped would soften me. I read the first 2 carefully. The rest remained unopened in a drawer, not because I hated him, but because I had nothing left to give that story. Grief was one thing. Reopening wounds was another. Marlene, too, reached out eventually. Not with apologies at first, more out of desperation. Her life had unraveled, quickly friends distancing themselves, legal trouble, knocking at her doorbells, piling up. She asked if I could help her get back on her feet. I told her gently, "You have to walk on your own now." It wasn't cruelty. It was boundary. And boundaries, I discovered, were the real antidote to betrayal. As weeks passed, something surprising began to happen. Hope crept in, quietly, like the first warm breeze after winter. I took up gardening again. My roses hadn't bloomed properly in years, probably sensing the tension that filled the house. Now, they flourished. I planted new hydrangeas along the fence line, their soft blues and purples reminding me of calm places I hadn't visited in a long time. I started volunteering at the senior center, helping with financial literacy workshops. The director loved the idea. "Older folks get targeted all the time," she said. "You can help them catch things before it's too late." Teaching others how to protect themselves felt deeply meaningful and strangely healing. Every time I showed a roomful of retirees how to check for suspicious transactions or how to identify predatory behavior, I felt my own wounds stitching closed. Life didn't become perfect, but it became honest, mine, and that was enough. One evening, weeks after the dinner, I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea as the sun dipped below the trees. The cicadas hummed. The neighborhood kids played in the street. The world felt steady again. Daniel walked up the driveway slowly, as if approaching a grave rather than a home. He didn't try to come inside. Instead, he stopped at the end of the walkway. "You look happier," he said softly. "I am," I replied. He nodded. "I hope someday you can forgive me." I considered that. Forgiveness wasn't for him, it was for me. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. Maybe one day. Maybe never. But healing didn't require rushing. It required honesty. Take care of yourself, Daniel, I said. He walked away. For the first time, I didn't watch him leave with sadness. I watched with closure. And as the sun disappeared, leaving streaks of pink and orange in the sky, I understood something deeply comforting. I hadn't just survived. I had reclaimed my life, piece by piece, choice by choice, step by step. It was a warm Friday evening when I returned to Harrington Steakhouse, the same place where my world had cracked open weeks earlier. But this time, I wasn't walking in as a woman, bracing for impact. I wasn't carrying an envelope of evidence like a shield. I wasn't pretending to smile through betrayal. I walked in as myself, lighter, steadier, and finally free. Linda waved from a booth near the window, her silver hair glowing in the soft light. 2 other friends from my quilting group sat with her, waving me over with the easy warmth that older women carry when they've lived through enough storms to appreciate clear skies. As I slid into the booth, the chatter rose around us. Birthdays, anniversaries, families catching up, couples sharing quiet dinners. Ordinary life, comforting life, the kind I had almost forgotten how to enjoy. You look peaceful, Linda said, studying my face the way only a friend of 40 years can. I feel peaceful, I replied, for the first time in a long while. She nodded knowingly. Freedom does that. We ordered dinner simple, familiar dishes. Salmon for me, chicken for Linda, and a shared dessert at the end. We talked about gardens, church projects, how the town council was arguing over parking meters again. And somewhere in the middle of it all, I realized that peace doesn't come in dramatic waves. It comes in small, steady breaths. After dinner, I excused myself for a moment and walked toward the back of the restaurant. My steps slowed as I passed the very table where Daniel and Marlene had delivered their theatrical announcement. The chairs were different tonight, but the memory still lingered, like a faint echo, one that no longer hurt, just reminded. I whispered a quiet goodbye to that moment in my life. It had shaped me, but it would not define me. When I returned to the table, Linda squeezed my hand. "You ready to move forward?" she asked. I smiled. Already started. The beauty of aging. One of the gifts we don't appreciate until we earn it is clarity. We stop pretending that time is limitless. We learn to choose peace even when chaos calls our name. And we begin to understand that truth, even painful truth, is a doorway, not a prison. Later that weekend, I sat on my porch with a notebook and wrote the things I wished someone had told me years ago. Not bitter things, not warnings coded in fear, but gentle truths, earned truths. I wrote, "Betrayal doesn't define you. Your response does. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is strategy. Sometimes it is strength. When someone shows you who they are, believe them, but do not let their choices harden your heart. Start over when you must. You are never too old to reclaim yourself." I closed the notebook and felt a warmth wash through me. Not pride exactly, but gratitude. Gratitude for surviving. Gratitude for choosing myself. Gratitude that life, even in our 60s, can still offer new chapters. A week later, something unexpected happened. Marlene reached out again, but not for money, not for excuses, not for pity. She called to say she was entering counseling, that she wanted to understand her choices, that she wanted to repair, not our relationship, not yet, but herself. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning, and beginnings matter. As for Daniel, He moved to a small apartment near the edge of town. He sent one last letter, not asking to reconcile, but thanking me for the years we shared and admitting that his choices were his own failures, not reflections of my worth. I read that letter twice. Then I placed it in a drawer, not a trash can. Not because I wanted to hold on to him, but because some stories don't end with flames. They end with quiet acceptance. On a beautiful Wednesday morning, I attended the final meeting with my attorney. The divorce was settled. Fairly, cleanly, firmly. He shook my hand and said, "You handled this with more grace than most people ever could." Maybe, or maybe older women simply learn to stand in storms without letting them swallow us. When I walked out of his office, the sun was warm on my face. I sat in my car, closed my eyes, and let myself feel the full weight of the moment. Not sadness, not triumph. Something softer. A beginning. A true one. And now, if you're listening to my story, whether from a cozy armchair, a quiet kitchen table, or a late-night drive, I want to leave you with this. Protect your heart, but don't barricade it. Guard your finances with wisdom, not fear. Speak up when something feels wrong. Your instincts are often wiser than your doubts. And remember, starting over is not a young person's privilege. It is a human privilege. It belongs to all of us, at any age. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of your own strength, or if it gave you the courage to take back a piece of your life, share it, tell it, hold it close, and know that you are not alone. Because healing is possible, rebuilding is possible, and peace, true steady peace, is waiting for you, just as it waited for me.